Week 11 of the 2024 fantasy football season is in the books, and we're headed straight into week 12 of the fantasy season. So you know exactly what we need to do. We need to go through every single matchup, every single wide receiver, and talk about who you should be starting and who you should be sitting as we move into week 12. And before we do so, let me remind you that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their Week 12 NFL Pick'ems are already going live, and Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 12's action. And on top of that, all new users who sign up on Underdog with promo code THECATCH, that link is down below, are also going to receive a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free NFL Pick'em to use towards this week's action, and up to $1,000 in bonus cash when you sign up on Underdog with promo code THECATCH. All right, very quickly here, we got 6 teams on bye week here in Week 12. Bye-ocalypse is here, and heads up, we got another one in Week 14. Nonetheless, here in Week 12, no Atlanta Falcons, no New York Jets, no Buffalo Bills, no New Orleans Saints, no Cincinnati Bengals, and no Jacksonville Jaguars. So, plenty of wide receivers on bye week here in Week 12. Make sure you guys are checking your lineups and making adjustments accordingly. All right, let's kick the video off with Thursday Night Football. We have the Steelers traveling to face the Browns for our short week game of the week here in Week 12. Let's start with the Steelers side of things. George Pickens continues to be a must-start player with Russell Wilson at the quarterback position. I was expecting a little bit more out of Pickens in Week 11 in that great matchup against the Ravens, as I was expecting more essentially out of all the Steelers offensive starters, but ended up being one of those kind of nitty-gritty divisional games. Nonetheless, although Pickens didn't score a touchdown, he still had a very good fantasy day, 16.9 fantasy points, 12 targets, 8 catches, 89 receiving yards. This is the wide receiver from a fantasy perspective to start on the Steelers team. Top 20 wide receiver thus far of the season, double digits in every week since Week 7. And even then, he's only given you single digits 3 times on the season. Pickens, a strong start, even on the short week, and a very good matchup against the Cleveland Browns, who just gave up a massive fantasy day to MVS of the New Orleans Saints. So start Pickens this week. He's a strong start once again. Unfortunately, didn't really get a whole lot of production out of any other wide receiver on this team in Week 11. We were expecting maybe like a nice little Mike Williams sprinkle or just something. Mike Williams, Calvin Austin, Van Jefferson combined for 0.9 fantasy points and a smash matchup against the Ravens. So I don't have any confidence, even in a good matchup once again this week against the Browns, in starting any of these guys. If you picked up Mike Williams, for example, you don't maybe have to drop him, but we're definitely not starting him this week. Let's see if anything else comes to fruition with the Steelers wide receivers who are not named George Pickens. Nonetheless, let's move along to the Browns, who I will admit I'm being kind of lazy with on a weekly basis. I think you can flex any of these guys. It's kind of difficult to call where the ceilings are, where the floors are. For example, we had a lot of confidence in Cedric Tillman going into Week 11 in a good matchup against the Saints. And it wasn't just us at this channel. Just about everybody out there in the fantasy community had confidence in Cedric Tillman. 7.7 fantasy points. Didn't score a touchdown for the first time in his last 3 starts. But what is encouraging is that he still had 8 targets. He just had 3 catches. That was tied with Elijah Moore, who had a good fantasy day and scored a touchdown and 18.6 fantasy points. But Elijah Moore also 8 targets. Then Jerry Jeudy ran away with the best fantasy day as he had 11 targets for 6 catches, 142 receiving yards, and a touchdown, 26.2 fantasy points. So all of these players still worthy of a flex option this week, even in a tougher matchup against the Steelers. Just kind of tough to call when we're going to get those floors and ceilings out of each individual player. Now, Elijah Moore has popped up on the injury report for Week 12 with a shoulder injury, so we'll continue to monitor that as the week progresses. If Elijah Moore doesn't play, more volume for Jeudy and Tillman. That helps their potential volume, right? But overall here, we got 3 good flex options on this roster at wide receiver. And kind of, we look at where they're rostered. Tillman in 73% of leagues, Judy in 68% of leagues, and Elijah Moore in 19% of leagues. These are flex options moving forward for the remainder of the season. But what we do know is that this team is going to throw the football first and foremost. They have thrown the football 41 or more times since Jameis Winston has become the starter. So there's going to be plenty of volume here. We'll see how it shakes out in Week 12. Moving along, let's take a look at the Titans traveling to face the Texans, and a disappointing day for Calvin Ridley owners in Week 11. Good matchup. Had double digits in 3 straight games, a ceiling of 25.4 fantasy points over the past 4 weeks. But in Week 11, just 9.8 fantasy points, 6 targets, 4 catches, 58 receiving yards. So Calvin Ridley, one of these guys, you can still definitely start him. I mean, he's a clear-cut number 1 wide receiver here. I think he's a solid start this week. And I think with the bye weeks, you're probably going to be in a position where if you own Calvin Ridley, you're probably rolling with him. But don't treat that like a bad thing. I know the ceiling was lower this week, but he's still a perfectly fine start against the Houston Texans secondary that's not been that great on the season. And the encouraging thing is that Will Levis, I mean, he certainly hasn't been fantastic, but he hasn't been terrible like he was early in the season. So I still think that this passing game for the Titans will result in enough production that we can start Calvin Ridley. Now, Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. This is a player that we talked about in recent videos and sneaky starts videos and last minute waiver wire videos. And people are like, nobody's going to pick up Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. And well, that's fine, but he has a touchdown in every game since Week 6, except for Week 10 against the Chargers. He has double digits in 3 of his last 4 games. He's just 7% rostered. Listen, I don't love him this week against the Texans, but if you're desperate, he has flex appeal. The main reason that I don't love him is because you take away the big play in Week 11 where he was just wide open, scored the big touchdown, then you're left with 1 catch on the day. So, and overall, over the past couple weeks, while that production has been there, the volume's been really low. I mean, he has 3 or less catches in every game since Week 6, except for Week 9 against the Patriots. So, listen, the flex appeal is there. We've talked about it in recent weeks, but I don't know how high the upside is. The big play turned into that 19.7 fantasy points we saw this past week. Be a little careful about chasing points here, but I do think he is an option and a startable player if you're struggling at the wide receiver or flex spot here in Week 12. Tyler Boyd just 5.4 fantasy points this past week, 5.4 or less fantasy points in each of his last 4 starts. Just no reason to start Tyler Boyd here in Week 12. Now, I am recording this video before Monday Night Football is played, so if anything drastic happens with Nico Collins or Tank Dell or any other player on the Texans roster or wide receiver or anything that changes my opinion here, there'll be a linked comment down below, but we're expecting Nico Collins to be fully ready to go in Week 11 against the Dallas Cowboys, and I'm going to imagine he has a good enough game that gives us enough confidence to start him against the Titans in Week 12. And Tank Dell, I still think is going to be startable as well. I think he's actually going to be better with Nico Collins on the field. It's been a little bit back and forth since we've seen no Stephon Diggs or no Nico Collins on the field for Dell, but he's still been good. And I still think that actually that defensive pressure being applied to Nico Collins going to open up things for Tank Dell. So once again, if my opinion here changes, there'll be a comment down below, but I think Collins and Dell, good starts here in Week 12. As far as anybody else here, it's just way too inconsistent between Bobby Trees and John Mechie and Xavier Hutchinson. Anybody else on this roster, no confidence in starting in Week 12. Next up, we have the Vikings traveling to face the Bears. And let's start with Justin Jefferson, who is a must-start player every single week. 14.1 fantasy points in Week 11. 8 targets, 6 grabs, 81 receiving yards. Not the best matchup here, but it doesn't matter when it's Justin Jefferson, your wide receiver 3 thus far on the season. Keep rolling with JJ. He only has single digits once on the season, of course, against the worst defense he's faced all year, the Jacksonville Jaguars. But come on, it's JJ. If you own JJ, you're not benching him, especially with 6 teams on bye week. Now, Jordan Addison did have the issues with leg cramps. I don't think it's going to be an issue going into week 12. I wouldn't imagine, but if for some reason he misses week 12, then obviously you're not starting him. But I mean, Jordan Addison for me is basically always in the flex area. It just depends on what you have. It's been very difficult to call when he's going to have those higher ceilings, better games, and when he's not. I mean, in week 10 against the Jags, just 4.9 fantasy points. In week 11, on paper, a much tougher matchup against the Titans, 15.1 fantasy points, 8 targets, 3 catches, 61 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Had 16.1 fantasy points in week 9 against the Colts. In the previous 2 weeks, 9.6 or less points. I mean, it's been all over the place with Jordan Addison. But if you own him, I mean, he's a flexible player, and that's about all we can really say about Jordan Addison moving forward. Jalen Naylor, the next man up here, 0 fantasy points in week 11. 7.7 or less in the last 4 starts. We just can't start Jalen Naylor. It's way too unpredictable. Now, DJ Moore, I talked a little bit about this past week. We got a new offensive coordinator. There's no way that you can't scheme up something for DJ Moore when he's seen awful involvement in the past couple weeks. And I mean, actually, he saw decent involvement, but the scheming was just awful, and the targets did not result in a lot of catches. 2 catches week 8, 4 week 9, 3 week 10, but it was much better this past week. 7 targets, 7 catches, 62 receiving yards, 13.7 fantasy points. So listen, I do not like the Chicago Bears wide receiver room from a fantasy perspective. I think it's way too inconsistent, way too difficult to call. We'll break down the other 2 guys here in a second, but if I had to start one player here, it's DJ Moore. It's a good enough matchup against the Vikings. The weakest part of this defense is easily the secondary. 7 targets, 7 catches, very encouraging to see compared to what we've seen over the past couple weeks, but it is worth noting, out of the 3 wide receivers you see on the screen, that was the least amount of targets for any Bears wide receiver. But yeah, I will start DJ Moore in the flex, and that's all it's going to be. And we'll see if this pattern stays the same. Now, Keenan Allen, 8 targets, 4 catches, 41 receiving yards, 8.1 fantasy points. I mean, this is about what you get out of Keenan Allen. Desperation flex. If you're looking for a couple points, a majority of you guys, I don't think I would bet, or I would roster Keenan Allen at this point in the season. I have no idea what we're going to get out of Keenan Allen on a weekly basis, but the ceiling is just non-existent. He had a big game against the Jags where he caught 2 touchdowns. Outside of that, it's been awful on the season. Rome Odunze, just very inconsistent. We look at the past 4 starts, 8.4 points, 15.4, 5.3, 12.5. 10 targets in week 11, 6 catches, 65 receiving yards. Made some nice plays in this game. Had the good game against Arizona, but it's just way too inconsistent. This is another player, and I talk about this a lot as we get to this point in the season, when you're rostering these players, and it's like, you never have the confidence to start Rome Odunze or Keenan Allen because it's way too inconsistent, then why are you even rostering them at this point in the season if you're never going to start them? Now, the bye weeks this week or week 14 may impact that to where you want to keep a player like this, but for majority of you guys, there's just no reason to really roster Keenan Allen or Rome Odunze at this point in the season, in my opinion, because it's way too volatile and the upside isn't too high. Like, it's not like a Jameson Williams where you might get 28 points, so he's worth rostering. You know, that type of volatility is worth hanging on to. It's just kind of like, there's no confidence here. So for me, I have no confidence in Keenan Allen or Rome Odunze as we move in to week 12. Next up, we're looking at the Dallas Cowboys traveling to face the Washington Commanders. Once again, I'm recording this before Monday Night Football, so it looks like CeeDee Lamb's going to play tonight. I guess we'll find out, and we'll find out what it looks like. And I think right now I still have Lamb in that kind of flex category. I think especially with the bye weeks, it's going to be tough to not have CeeDee Lamb in your starting lineup. Now, if he doesn't play week 11, does that bleed into week 12? Does he re-aggravate the back injury or whatever it is, back shoulder injury? We'll find out. Nonetheless, I guess the Commanders, he's probably still a good flex option. Now, I said this, and this might make me look dumb since I am recording this before Monday Night Football, but I don't have a problem with it. Like, there's still, as the weeks go on, this offense will figure out something. You know, it's not going to be the same as it was before. We're not going to see 39.6 fantasy points out of CeeDee Lamb like we saw in week 8, but as the season progresses with Cooper Rush at quarterback, I don't think we're going to see much of Trey Lance. They're going to figure out something, and that should result in decent stat lines out of CeeDee Lamb, Rico Dowdle, and potentially Jake Ferguson, and they're going to be playing from behind more than likely. So we'll get more answers post Monday Night Football. And of course, I'll have a pinned comment down below if this video is going to drop right after Monday Night Football. So we'll see what happens here. But I still got Lamb kind of in that flex category. The upside's not going to be as high. But, the Texans, the Commanders, the Giants, and the Bengals the next 4 weeks, those are better matchups than the Philadelphia Eagles, who have been locking down opposing wide receiver ones and playing at a very high level defensively. So I do expect better things out of Lamb moving forward. Anybody else on this roster, though? Jalen Tolbert, Javonte Turpin, I have no interest in right now. I don't think they need to be rostered unless we see CeeDee Lamb just disappear into the shadows due to injuries. He did get his contract this past offseason, so with no Prescott, I still think that might happen, but we'll find out. Nonetheless, Scary Terry, not so scary in week 11. Dropped back to the wide receiver 5 on the season. I think Terry's going to be fine. We just talked about the Eagles locking up wide receiver ones. Yeah, they locked up Terry in week 11. 2 targets, 1 catch. 10 receiving yards, but if you own Terry, you can't read too much into this. He's had 13.4 or more fantasy points in every game since week 3 of the season, with a ceiling of 23.3 fantasy points. I mean, it's a good matchup here against the Dallas Cowboys. You own Terry McLaurin. Do not overthink this one. You are starting Terry McLaurin. I literally got comments this past week like, do I drop Terry McLaurin after that performance? No. What are you talking about? It's one game. Don't drop Terry. Don't bench Terry. He's still a strong start here in week 12. Anybody else on this team, though? Zacchaeus, Noah Brown. I mean, just all season long, we've been searching for somebody. Luke McCaffrey, somebody step up as a wide receiver 2, and we just haven't gotten that. There's just nobody else to start from a fantasy perspective at the wide receiver position on this team. So Terry McLaurin, strong start this week. CeeDee Lamb, I think will end up being a decent flex option this week. We'll find out as we get into week 12. And I love this matchup for Terry McLaurin. I would be heading straight to Underdog to take the over on his receiving yards, sitting at 60.5 receiving yards. He has hit that in 3 of his last 5 matchups. I think he's going to bounce back in big fashion in this divisional matchup against the Cowboys here in week 12. So I would head straight to Underdog, take the over on McLaurin's receiving yards. Don't forget, all new users on Underdog are getting that free NFL Pick Em for week 12 when you sign up with promo code TheCatch. That link is down below. Take your free Pick Em. Take the over on McLaurin's receiving yards. Once both of those lines hit, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, as long as you sign up on Underdog with promo code TheCatch, they're also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. Okay, let's move on to the New England Patriots traveling to face the Miami Dolphins. And I just absolutely despise the New England Patriots wide receiver room from a fantasy perspective. Now, going into week 11, we did talk about Demario Douglas, and I said it several times last week. Said in the Sneaky Starts video. I said it in the Last Minute Waiver videos. If you need 10 fantasy points, I literally said this more than once. I think Demario Douglas will get you about 10 fantasy points in week 11. He had 10.9 fantasy points, 7 targets, 5 catches, 59 receiving yards in week 11. So we know about the ceiling of Demario Douglas missing that kind of receiving touchdown upside. He's only had 1 receiving touchdown on the season in week 6. But nonetheless, I don't really like any New England Patriots wide receiver this week. We're seeing this volume get spread around in just a super annoying way. I mean, it's good that they're throwing the football, don't get me wrong, but it's just way too hard to really call on a weekly basis what the volume's going to look like. And this is a bad matchup against the Miami Dolphins. This pass defense is no joke. The Patriots on the road here, I'm staying away from everybody involved here. Kayshon Boutte, 6 targets, 4 catches, 7.3 fantasy points this past week. Kendrick Bourne, 5 targets, 5 catches, 70 receiving yards, a touchdown, 18 fantasy points, easily the best stat line out of this bunch. But 8.1 or less fantasy points in every other matchup on the season. Bad matchup this week. Then Jalen Polk went from having a receiving touchdown in week 10. That was his only catch in week 10 to 0 catches in week 11. Like, we just can't call the consistency here. It's not a good matchup. Just no thank you. If you're absolutely desperate, I always revert back to Demario Douglas, but I don't feel good about any of these guys this week. Okay, Miami Dolphins. Tyreek Hill, a higher ceiling. I mean, we can feel a little bit good here about Tyreek Hill. He's had 12 or 11.7 or more fantasy points in each of his last 4 starts. His best fantasy performance since week 1 of the season in week 11. And the Raiders have been pretty good against wide receivers on the season. 8 targets, 7 catches, 61 receiving yards, a touchdown, 19.1 fantasy points. So, yeah, no reason to bench Hill this week. The Patriots have been okay defensively, but that's just kind of where they are. Like, they're okay. You own Hill, bye weeks, all that stuff, fire him up. Why not? Let's just continue to start Tyreek Hill. Now, Jalen Waddle, I have said, is a sit for weeks. I've been one of the few, it feels like. I'm like, don't start Jalen Waddle. Don't trade for Jalen Waddle. What value is there with Jalen Waddle on the season? I mean, he had the big game against the worst defense in the league in week 1 against the Jaguars, 16.2 fantasy points. He has had 8.6 or less fantasy points in every game on the season. 5.7 in week 11, 3 targets, 2 catches, 37 receiving yards. I mean, there's just no reason to start Jalen Waddle. Sure, at some point in the season, he'll probably pop again and have another double-digit game, but it's like, are you going to trust him after that point? Call me crazy. If I own Jalen Waddle right now, he's in that category of like, I'm never going to start him. Why is he on my roster? So Jalen Waddle, I have no confidence in. Going into week 12, he's been a complete bust on the season. Knowing that I'm ranting about him right now, maybe he'll have a good game, so consider that. But nonetheless, there's no reason to have confidence in Waddle. Jonnu Smith is the second pass catcher on this team. Devon Achane's the third pass catcher. Hill's obviously number 1. Waddle's towards the end of the pecking order here. To continue on that trend, Odell Beckham had more targets than Jalen Waddle this past week. So, yeah, I'm sitting Waddle, and I am sitting any other Dolphins receiver that's not Tyreek Hill here in week 12. And next up, let's take a look at the Kansas City Chiefs traveling to face the Carolina Panthers. And let's start with the Chiefs side of things. So, going into week 10, I got a lot of heat because I called DeAndre Hopkins no more than a flex option and a tough matchup against the Denver Broncos right after he had that huge game against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But what we've seen in Hopkins over the past 2 weeks is he's not playing the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who've allowed these massive games to wide receivers. He's been facing the Denver Broncos and the Buffalo Bills, 2 top 10 units against the wide receiver position thus far on the season. And even last week, I had a little bit more confidence in Hopkins because I was expecting, what we saw, a good game script and the Chiefs needing to throw the football more. But it just didn't really end up involving Hopkins. 4 targets, 3 catches, 29 receiving yards. So if you own Hopkins right now, you're probably not feeling that great. But I still have him as a start this week. He should probably, truthfully, be in the flex category next to Xavier Worthy because it hasn't been very encouraging the past couple weeks. But I just got one of those feelings. Carolina Panthers, good matchup. We could see a big game out of the Chiefs coming off of that loss, at their first loss on the season against the Bills. So I do like Hopkins this week. I think with all the bye weeks, I'm just going to leave Hopkins in the start category, but he might be kind of more in the fringe kind of flex area. But Hopkins should be good enough this week to help get you through. And I do think we'll see a bit of a higher ceiling than the past 2 weeks and 2 tough matchups. Xavier Worthy, I mean, I've had him as a sit in recent weeks too, but he's back in the flex area. It's just been very inconsistent here. I was originally going to leave him as a sit, but I do like him in this matchup against the Panthers because they also struggle against running backs and running the teams that run the football, and Xavier Worthy might get involved here and there running the football as well. So I think Worthy's startable in the flex if you're desperate, but let's just look at the past 4 weeks. 13.7 fantasy points in week 8, -1 in week 9 in a good game script, 2.1 in week 10, also good game script, 16.8 in week 11. Good game script too. But 5 targets, 4 catches, 61 receiving yards, scored the touchdown early in that game. So, I mean, sure, this is a good matchup. I think it could benefit Xavier Worthy. He's flexible, but you got to understand this is one of those players that comes with good highs, really bad lows. You got to consider the floor and the ceiling here, but he's flexible. Why not? Now, Juju Smith-Schuster, I was excited to see how he would be involved in week 11. But not so much excitement if you picked him up and stashed him. 1 target, 1 catch, 8 receiving yards. Keep an eye on Juju, who's sitting at 13% rostered, but he's definitely kind of down the pecking order. And then the other issue is you just never really know what Andy Reid's going to scheme up on a weekly basis. The other names here would be McCole Hardman, who had 3 targets in week 11, and Justin Watson, who had 2 targets. Neither of them had more than 4.6 fantasy points. Not going to be starts this week. Moving along, let's take a look at the Carolina Panthers options here. Xavier Leggett and potentially the return of Adam Thielen. We'll find out. But right now, he is expected to play in week 12. You never know. Something pops up last minute, though. And the next on the list would be Jalen Coker. So I think Leggett and Thielen are flexible this week. Not a great matchup, of course, but they're at home. The Panthers have been throwing the football more and with slight more efficiency in Bryce Young's last 2 starts. So this could be kind of a disastrous game for the Panthers, or it could be just another one of these kind of okay games where I don't think that we get a high ceiling out of Leggett or Thielen, but with the bye weeks, these guys could end up giving a respectable stat line. So far in today's video, they are my least favorite flex options, but they could present enough volume, especially in a game script where I'm expecting the Panthers to need to throw the football, that you could get a respectable stat line. Now, Thielen still carries that asterisk because he is fresh off the hamstring injury. We haven't seen him play since week 3. Don't love starting him since he is coming off the hamstring injury. I would maybe prefer him a little bit more in week 13 against the Bucs, but if you've been holding on to him, if you pick him up off the waiver wire, which he's sitting at 34% rostered, you could risk it, but have limited expectations. I would prefer to start Xavier Leggett, who at least has 2 double-digit performances in his last 4 starts. I do think Jalen Coker is going to be kind of pushed to the back of the pecking order here, and I don't consider Jalen Coker a player that needs to be rostered at this given time. We've seen double digits just once in his last 4 starts, and that was basically because of a garbage time touchdown against the Broncos. So he's off the radar for me. Leggett, Thielen, some flex appeal, not my favorite flex options. And Hopkins, close to the flex area. Worthy, definitely in the flex area. This will be an interesting matchup. We'll see how it shakes out in week 12. Next up, we have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers traveling to face the Giants. And thank the fantasy gods, we're probably going to get Mike Evans back in week 12. We've missed a true pass catcher on this Bucs team. He has practiced at the time I'm recording this. He practiced today on Monday, so that is a good sign. And this is a good matchup for him against the Giants. He gets another good matchup against the Panthers in week 13. This is what you've been waiting for. Once again, I mean, I never love starting a player fresh off of injury, but player Mike Evans caliber, and with all the bye weeks, I think if you own Mike Evans, you probably are rolling him out with some confidence this week. So I would say just fire up Mike Evans. As long as he's off the injury report, he's good to go, then you are good to go to start him in your fantasy lineup. Anybody else at the wide receiver position on this team, I'm just not interested in at the moment. Now, with Evans on the field, I do think that positively impacts Jalen McMillan and Sterling Shepard, and hopefully somebody steps into that Chris Godwin-like role. But we just haven't got a lot of production out of the two in the absence of Evans and Godwin. So we'll see what happens. We'll monitor it, but we're not starting either player in fantasy. Now, on the other hand, Malik Neighbors kind of has this lower perceived value right now, lower ceilings in the past couple weeks. And now we're getting Tommy DeVito at quarterback. So I will admit, I made this list before the Tommy DeVito announcement was announced. I thought we would have a higher chance of seeing Drew Lock at quarterback, but hey, Tommy DeVito did some stuff last year, and they won some games with DeVito. But worth noting, he only had one game over 191 passing yards, and that was in Week 11 against the Commanders, 246 passing yards. And don't forget, the Commanders were a bottom 2 unit in terms of their secondary all season long last year. I mean, they were getting torched last season. So I don't quite know how I feel about the starting quarterback situation just yet. I do like me some Tommy DeVito. Don't get me wrong. He is fun to watch. But I'll say this much. It's a good matchup. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers have been very bad against opposing wide receivers. So I will still start Malik Neighbors, and it's not like it's going to be that much worse than Daniel Jones. I think the floor is still here for Neighbors. Mind you, Malik Neighbors has a fantastic strength of schedule the rest of the season. The Bucs, the Cowboys, the Saints, the Ravens, the Falcons, the Colts. I'm firing up Malik Neighbors until further notice. At worst, you're going to get a solid floor, in my opinion. We'll find out. I do think that Rondell Robinson is flexible. We'll see how things shake out for the rest of wide receivers, where the chemistry is, where it isn't. But I think that Robinson is in that flex category based on matchup this week. I think he's going to be one of these guys that you can still throw in the flex and get about 10 fantasy points on a bad day, 8 fantasy points, and hopefully a ceiling starts to emerge that's closer to like 13 or 14 fantasy points, like we saw between weeks 1 and 5 on the season for the most part. So I think he's flexible because, once again, the Bucs are bad, to say the least, against opposing wide receivers. Darius Slayton, Jalen Hyatt, anybody else here, not going to be starts going into week 12 for me. So hopefully we get Evans back, and I think that we are going to, and then we'll see how things shake out for the Giants with Tommy DeVito quarterback. But I think Neighbor is going to be okay here in week 12. Next up, we have the Lions traveling to face the Colts. The Lions coming off a monstrous performance against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Amon-Ra St. Brown is now your wide receiver 2 on the season. 38.7 fantasy points, his best mark on the season. 11 targets, 11 catches, 161 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns. Amon-Ra has a touchdown in every game since week 3. He's a stud. It's a good matchup. Start Amon-Ra. Must-start player every single week. Nothing to break down. Jameson Williams, we had as a flex last week. We had him in the sneaky starts video. Very good day for him. 22.6 fantasy points, 6 targets, 4 catches, 124 receiving yards, a big touchdown. Yeah, there's volatility with Jameson Williams. We also liked him going into week 10. Didn't quite happen there. Plays a strong role in this offense. He's a good flex option. Tons of upside. Might not be as open of a game script as what we saw in week 11, but Dan Campbell and the Lions, they don't take their foot off of the gas whatsoever in these matchups. So regardless of what happens, he has a good floor, I think, in this matchup, and he's got a high ceiling in this matchup as well. In terms of anybody else here, Allen Robinson, Khalif Raymond, Tim Patrick, we're just not seeing any consistency, not seeing enough production here, so none of those guys are going to be starts. Moving along to the Colts, I had Josh Downs as a start throughout last week. Still liked him even towards the end of the week with the Anthony Richardson announcement and everything. And Downs has been a true wide receiver 2 on the season in terms of fantasy lineups. Wide receiver 20 so far on the season. In games that he's played in, as he missed the first 2 weeks of the season, he has double digits in every game except for 2. 19.4 fantasy points in week 11. 5 targets, 5 catches, 84 receiving yards, a touchdown. Good matchup against the Lions this week. Weakest part of this defense is the secondary. He's going to see the best volume, most touchdown upside in my opinion. Good start this week. Michael Pittman, a better day than we've seen in the last 4 starts. 9.6 fantasy points, 8 targets, 5 catches, 46 receiving yards. I mean, if he had caught a touchdown, this would have been a good fantasy outing. I just don't love Michael Pittman. I have a hard time trusting him. I don't think he's like a player that you're going to drop. He might be kind of close to that area of like, I don't know if I'm ever going to trust him. Should I start him? But I think with Richardson at quarterback, as things start to get kind of rolling here, and we figure out if this team's going to be productive on a regular basis, he's still worth holding on to. But I'm just not ready to start him unless you're desperate going into the week. Alec Pierce does have double digits in his last 2 games. But, I mean, kind of the issue with Alec Pierce is he catches that big pass, and that adds to his fantasy stat line. And then if you take away the big pass, it's just not really there. Week 10, you take away the touchdown, it's not really there. The volume is very inconsistent. I just don't think he's worth risking. But he is a top 18 wide receiver on the season so far. So if you want to risk it, I mean, be my guest. I just don't think it's worth it. Way too volatile. A.D. Mitchell, just one catch this past week, also way too volatile. Not somebody that I'm looking to start. Outside of that, we don't have anybody who's fantasy relevant on this roster. So feel good about Josh Downs. Everybody else, let's kind of just sit back and see what happens here with A-Rich as a starting quarterback. And for the Lions, you know what to do. You start Amon-Ra. Jameson Williams, great flex option here in week 12. Next up, we have the Broncos, who are traveling to face the Raiders. Courtland Sutton, one of my must-start players in week 11. I did expect a little bit more out of Sutton in that great matchup against the Falcons, but 8 targets, 7 catches, 78 receiving yards, resulting in 14.8 fantasy points, was still a good fantasy outing. Devon Vele had a good day as well, 10.6 fantasy points. Troy Franklin had a nice day by his standards, 9.5 fantasy points, scored a touchdown, and we saw a big day out of Lil Jordan Humphrey, who scored a touchdown and had 15.2 fantasy points. So, great day for the Broncos overall in a 38-6 victory. We almost saw 4 wide receivers have double-digit fantasy points as Franklin missed the mark by just 0.5 fantasy points, and Marvin Mims also had a big day. So, my apologies. I forgot about that. We actually did have 4 wide receivers on this team have double-digit fantasy points, and we nearly saw 5 have double-digit fantasy performances. But I'm going to temper my expectations. Once again, we got a lot of guys here. It was a blowout-type victory. Probably not going to boil over into week 12. The Raiders have been pretty good against opposing wide receivers all season long. I mean, Mims had 2 targets. Lil Jordan Humphrey had 4 targets. Franklin had 2 targets. Vele had 5 targets. So not a lot of consistency there. Then you boil down the rest of the weeks previous, no consistency whatsoever for those guys. So for me, it's still start Courtland Sutton. Everybody else is a sit. This team is becoming a lot more efficient. We've talked about Bo Nix for weeks on the channel. Now, all of a sudden, everybody wants to talk about Bo Nix. Nonetheless, he's been very good throwing the football, and maybe somebody emerges here as a consistent option. But until we see that pattern of consistency, it's just Courtland Sutton for me and nobody else. But one line that I absolutely love on Underdog this week is Courtland Sutton's receiving yards, sitting at 56.5 receiving yards. I know on paper this is a little bit of a tougher matchup, but he has hit this line in 4 straight games. He's the heartbeat of this passing attack for the Broncos. I'm going to go ahead and head straight to Underdog, smash the over on Sutton's total receiving yards, and don't forget, guys, all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH on Underdog are getting that free NFL Pick Em on Underdog to use towards week 12. Take your free Pick Em, take the over on Sutton's receiving yards, and while you're doing that, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free NFL Pick'em, a chance to triple a cash entry on Underdog here in week 12, and up to $1,000 in bonus cash when you sign up on Underdog with promo code THECATCH. That link is down below. Moving along to the Raiders, Jacoby Myers. I expected just a little bit more out of in week 11. He has shined in tough matchups, but against the Dolphins, just 8.8 fantasy points, 6 targets, 4 catches, 28 receiving yards. This was basically a Brock Bowers game, and nobody else really saw any type of volume in this matchup. But Myers is in that flex category. The last time he played the Broncos, he had 13.2 fantasy points, 9 targets, 6 catches, 72 receiving yards. So I think he's flexible given the fact that we have 6 teams on bye week, and the last time he played the Broncos, he still got you at least 13 fantasy points. If we weren't dealing with the bye weeks and he hadn't played well in the last matchup against the Broncos, he'd probably be a sit because I try to avoid number 1 wide receivers against Pat Surtain and company, but he's flexible given the circumstances. Trey Tucker, DJ Turner, anybody else on this roster are just sits. Nobody that we need to consider from a fantasy perspective. So we'll see what happens. Good little divisional matchup here in week 12. Moving along to another divisional matchup, we have the Cardinals traveling to face the Seahawks. Let's start with the Cardinals side of things, as we saw them last in week 10, as they were on bye week in week 11. Marvin Harrison Jr., 16.4 fantasy points, 5 targets, 5 catches, 54 receiving yards, a touchdown. Good matchup this week. Don't really see any reason why you would sit Marvin Harrison Jr., especially with all the bye weeks. So I know we've seen volatility in the last 4 starts, 5.1 fantasy points, 23.1, 3.4, 16.4. But ultimately, you just got to keep rolling with Marvin Harrison Jr., especially given the circumstances of the week. Next up, you'd have Michael Wilson and Greg Dortch, who just no consistency whatsoever. Not enough high ceilings, not enough production. Maybe somebody steps up and gives us a consistent pattern. We've maybe been close to seeing that out of Michael Wilson at points in the season, but I just can't do it with these guys. Just not enough flex appeal, even given the circumstances of 6 teams on bye weeks. I just can't do it. So I'm going to stay away from both of them. Then we move along to the Seahawks. And I will admit, just so you guys know, I meant to put JSN in the start category, but he's still in the flex category. That was my mistake, but we'll leave it, and you guys can make fun of me in the comments down below. But Metcalf, 14 fantasy points in his return since he suffered that knee injury in week 7. 9 targets, 7 catches, 70 receiving yards. I mean, we just start DK Metcalf on a weekly basis. Way too good of a player to bench. Has missed 2 games on the season. Had his bye week already. He's still the wide receiver 25 on the season, so he's a solid start. I will say this Cardinals defense right now, nothing to sneeze at, but I do like Metcalf. No reason to dislike him. Now, JSN has looked very good over the past 2 weeks, and we kind of had that inconsistency. He was still a startable player, kind of really through the first 8 weeks of the season, right? Was giving you a pretty good floor for most weeks. We saw the ceiling in week 2, kind of back and forth, 3 single-digit performances in that stretch, but in his last 2 starts, 21.8 or more fantasy points with 37 fantasy points in week 9. So JSN, 11 targets, 10 catches, 110 receiving yards, 2 more targets than Metcalf, and Tyler Lockett, just 3 total targets. And then next up, you're looking at Noah Fant, who didn't even play this past week, so it would have been AJ Barner, who had just 4 targets, and then Kenneth Walker, who had 2 targets. So, I mean, JSN, right now, the wide receiver 1 on this team. He had 13 targets in week 9 before the bye week in week 10. So JSN, I think, is a good start, is what I'm trying to get to here, and really should not be in the flex category. But for majority of the season, this has been my viewpoint on this wide receiver room. Start Metcalf. You can always flex JSN. You can always flex Lockett and cross your fingers. But right now, that pattern that's emerging for JSN is that he's a strong start moving forward. And especially with the bye weeks, if you own JSN, start JSM. You guys can make fun of me for accidentally putting him in the flex category, but we look at the season as a whole. Single digits just 3 times on the year. I think we're starting JSN moving forward no matter what. Lockett is the one suffering the most. No Metcalf in week 9, so Lockett had a good game because he caught the touchdown, but he's been pretty quiet now that we've seen Lockett and JSN start to take over volume. Just 3 targets, 2 catches for Lockett in week 11. He can always pop. He's in that flex area, but he's my least favorite start out of these 3 wide receivers. So we'll see how it all shakes out in week 12 in a good divisional matchup at home for the Seahawks. Next up, we have the San Francisco 49ers, who are going to travel to face the Green Bay Packers. And let's start with the San Francisco 49ers side of things. Let's take a look at Deebo Samuel. Disappointing week 11. Fantasy day, 6.1 fantasy points, 7 targets, 4 catches, 22 receiving yards. Good matchup on paper against the Seahawks. Good game script, right? And just a disappointing fantasy day overall. But I still think if you own Deebo, especially with the bye weeks, he's a good start this week. And Green Bay Packers secondary, nothing to sneeze at, but at the end of the day, Deebo Samuel is still a good start this week. We know what you get out of Deebo. You get that volatility, high ceilings at times, lower floors at times, but you own Deebo, you probably just got to roll with the punches. Now, Jawan Jennings, we talked a lot about going into week 10 and going into week 11, and had a great day in week 11. He was in the must-start video, 25.1 fantasy points, 11 targets, 10 catches, 91 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Over the past 2 weeks, this is the guy looking like the wide receiver one for the Niners. And Brock Purdy really likes whatever wide receiver is playing in that X role. And they are not taking Jennings out of that role anytime soon. He's a strong start this week. A little bit of a tougher matchup in comparison to the past 2 weeks. Another 2 tough matchups against the Bills and the Chicago Bears in the next 2 coming weeks, but he's going to see the volume, good chemistry with Purdy. Big week in week 11, top 20 receiver on the season. Keep rolling with Jennings. Ricky Pearsall, 2 targets, no catches in week 11. Very disappointing after he had double digits in his last 2 starts. So I'm putting Ricky in the sit category. Let's see if we can get a consistent pattern to emerge once again. Maybe this was 1 week. Maybe it was a fluke. Maybe he'll be better this week. I don't think I really want to find out. I don't really want you guys to find out. Definitely a player that we can still roster, but let's sit him until further notice. Now, you guys know through the majority of the season, I've been pretty lazy with the Green Bay Packers wide receivers. I believe in starting Jayden Reed. I believe that Dobbs is flexible, and I believe that Watson has flex value. I mean, at times, we saw Dontavion Wicks move into the flex area too, but outside of that, that's basically been my viewpoint on the Packers wide receiver room all season long, and Reed is the most startable player out of this bunch, but he was disappointing in week 11. He is somehow still the wide receiver 7 on the season. He's really capitalized on those 2 big games that we saw through the first 4 weeks of the season. I mean, he still has had a good season. He only has single digits 4 times on the season and barely missed the mark. This past week, he did score a touchdown, but it's just like, what do you do with this wide receiver room? I mean, Christian Watson had a big game this past week, 19 fantasy points. He had 8.7 in the previous 3 games. Dobbs, 2 double-digit games in his past 4 games. 2 single-digit performances in that stretch as well. Dontavion Wicks has fallen off the face of the earth. So, listen, you own Reed, Dobbs, or Watson. You can always flex these guys. I still prefer Jayden Reed out of this wide receiver room. It's not the greatest matchup here, but we should get a good game script, So, yeah, you can start any of these guys in the flex, but your guess is as good as mine as to what's going to happen in terms of a ceiling or a floor here in week 12. Next up, we have the Philadelphia Eagles traveling to face the LA Rams, and this might be the best matchup overall in terms of wide receivers in today's video. Let's talk about A.J. Brown, who had a little bit of a lower ceiling and has had a bit of a lower ceiling in the past 4 weeks with 15.9 fantasy points or less in his last 4 starts, 11.5 in week 11, 8 targets, 5 catches, 65 receiving yards. But I'm not too concerned about A.J. Brown. I know some people are a bit concerned. He's already had his bye week. He's missed 3 games on the season, and he's still the wide receiver 22 on the season. So there's no reason to bench A.J. Brown. Good matchup this week. Should get a good competitive game script here on Sunday Night Football. Primetime game. So roll out A.J. Brown this week. Gets another good matchup against the Ravens in week 13. Another good matchup in week 14 against the Panthers. I think if you own A.J. Brown, you have any concerns, the next 3 weeks are probably going to take care of that. And if you own Devonta Smith and you have concerns, the next couple weeks are also probably going to take care of that. I know more people worried about Smith than Brown. I've gotten plenty of comments like, is it time to drop Devonta Smith? No, I still stand by that viewpoint of Devonta Smith, has a couple of these bad games each year, and he just kind of fight through it. You look back to last week, he had a stretch between weeks 5 and 7 with single-digit fantasy performances. Then after that, he had double digits in every game except for the final game of the fantasy season in week 17. So, I mean, you're going to get some volatility out of this caliber wide receiver. He's a wide receiver 2 on your roster. I'm just not worried about it. It was a good game script in week 11. Like week 10, you kind of had the excuse, like he wasn't really necessary. You would have liked to see more involvement in a good game script against the Commanders, but ultimately, he should be much better against the Rams, Ravens, Panthers over the next couple weeks. And I would expect overall in the season, Devonta Smith is going to be just fine. He's still a start for me. Maybe you're kind of downgrading him to the flex area, whatever. Maybe you have other options you're more confident in. That's okay too. But overall, I'm still calling Devonta Smith a start in week 12. Now, looking at the Rams wide receivers, we know what the deal is here already. You start Cooper Kupp. You start Puka Nacua unless they're injured. Cooper Kupp, 28.6 fantasy points in Week 11, 2 tutties, 10 targets, 6 catches, 106 receiving yards. That's 15 or more fantasy points in every game since he's returned from injury. It is a tough matchup. I think some people are going to go into this week saying, I don't know if I'm starting Kupp or Puka Nacua because this Eagles secondary right now is shutting down opposing wide receiver ones. But I think with the bye weeks, everything going on here, the high ceilings out of both these receivers this past week, like, sure, maybe we see a lower ceiling this week. I think you're still starting Kupp. And I think you're still starting Puka Nacua, who had 25.3 fantasy points, 9 targets, 7 catches, 123 receiving yards, and a touchdown in Week 11. Double digits for Puka in every game since he's returned from injury in Week 8, except for the game he decided to throw some haymakers instead of playing football in Week 9, where he got ejected. And, I mean, who knows what would have really happened in that game. We saw Demarcus Robinson step up and win that game for the Rams. Maybe that would have been Puka Nacua if he stayed in the game. Who knows? Speaking of Demarcus Robinson, since that big performance in Week 9, 3.9 or less fantasy points, I was starting to get excited again about Robinson, and it just hasn't been there. Can't feel good about him going up against the Eagles this week. Jordan Whittington hasn't had a catch since Week 5. Tutu Atwell has not had more than 3.1 fantasy points since Week 7. This wide receiver room has purely turned into Kupp, Puka Nacua. That's it. I'm going to say go ahead and start them. Maybe a little bit of a lower ceiling this week, but I think they're going to be okay to start here in Week 12. All right, last but not least, Monday Night Football. We got a good matchup between the Ravens and the Chargers. So let's start with the Ravens side of things. Zay Flowers, low ceiling, 11.9 fantasy points, 6 targets, 2 receptions, 39 receiving yards, but he did have a touchdown off of those 2 receptions and still gave you 11.9 fantasy points. So Zay Flowers, I think, is still a good start this week. You might see another low ceiling as the Ravens are on the road, and it is a tough matchup against the Chargers. But the Chargers defense also just got shredded by Jamar Chase and T. Higgins in that victory on Sunday Night Football this past week. So who knows exactly what we're going to get. But Zay Flowers, I mean, ultimately still has had a very good season. He's a wide receiver 9 in fantasy football. It's another good example of a wide receiver who has a lot of volatility, but you just keep rolling with and taking the punches. I would start Zay Flowers if I own him. Undoubtedly, especially with the bye weeks going into Week 12. As far as anybody else here, I mean, Rashad Bateman, 5 targets, 2 catches this past week. Nelson Aguilar, 1 target, 0 catches this past week. Tylan Wallace, who had the big game in Week 10, 1 target, 1 catch. Devontae Walker has not had a single target this year in his rookie season. And, oh yeah, I just wanted to name everybody except for Deontay Johnson before I named Deontay Johnson, who in his big revenge game, 2 targets, 0 catches, 0 fantasy points on the field for 18% of snaps. Why did the Ravens trade for Deontay Johnson? Does anybody know? I don't know why they have done this, but he is not a start at this point in the season. And I think his roster percentage sitting at 67% rostered is going to drop pretty drastically as we have 2 tough matchups against the Chargers and the Eagles in the next 2 weeks for the Ravens before a Week 14 bye week. So if you're asking me, I've already dropped Deontay Johnson from any teams outside of Dynasty Leagues where I own Deontay Johnson. So he's not a start, and this is just a very head-scratching decision thus far. Hopefully, as the season continues and the Ravens push into the playoffs, he sees some sort of involvement. Nonetheless, let's take a look at the Chargers wide receivers in a great matchup against the Baltimore Ravens. I know that the Ravens were a little bit stricter on defense this past week and played arguably their best defensive game of the season thus far, but this is still a very poor secondary, and Ladd McConkey and Quentin Johnston coming off of double-digit performances against the Bengals. Ladd McConkey, 18.3 fantasy points, 9 targets, 6 catches, 123 receiving yards, a game-ceiling catch in that game as well, is a strong start here in week 12. He has 11.4 or more fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 starts. Continue to feel good about starting Ladd McConkey. Quentin Johnston, a player that we have talked about a lot on the channel over the past couple weeks, is a top priority add at 58% rostered on the waiver wire. 12.8 fantasy points in week 11. 8 targets, just 2 catches. A little disheartening, but still 48 receiving yards and 8 tutty in week 11. He has 3 touchdowns in 3 straight games. Keep rolling with Quentin Johnston as a solid flex option and also a good start if you need to roll him in, as we are facing a lot of bye weeks here in week 12. I like both those Chargers wide receivers a lot this week. Next man up is Josh Palmer, who had 4.3 fantasy points. Anybody else on this roster, just not a start here in week 12, but this should be a good competitive game script. McConkey, Johnston, Flowers, all good starts to wrap up week 12. And that'll do it for today's video. There's every single wide receiver, every single matchup, who you should be starting, who you should be sitting as we approach week 12 of the season. As always, guys, I'm answering every single fantasy football question that you guys have in the comment section down below. So be sure to drop me a comment. I'll make sure I answer all your guys' questions before Thursday Night Football and before Sunday's slate of games. Most importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of this week's content, because we're going to have everything you could possibly need to help you dominate week 12 of 2024 fantasy football on the channel. So be sure to hit that subscribe button. And if you guys liked the video, be sure to drop a like as well. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, saw it here on The Catch.